In a hospital where decisions are made in seconds, a dedicated professional faces much more than just the fatigue of an exhausting shift. The arrival of a powerful man transforms a simple hallway into a stage for humiliation, injustice, and an error that cannot be undone. What seemed to be just another abuse of authority gradually reveals hidden connections and silent forces about to act. And when everything falls apart, it becomes clear that some people were never as alone as they believed, and others were never as protected. Before you get to know this intense story of downfall, power, and consequences, be prepared. Not all silence is weakness, and not all revenge needs to be announced. The 6 a.m. shift at the Instituto Paulista de Excelencia Medica always began in the same way, with the smell of 70% alcohol mixed with the weak coffee from the nurse's break room, with the metallic noise of medication carts sliding down the general ICU hallway, and with the voice of Renata Souza organizing the world around her before the world tried to disorient her. It was a ritual she had built over 11 years in that unit, brick by brick, shift by shift, until it became part of the invisible structure of that place, as essential as the walls and as discreet as the air that circulated through the climate-controlled hallways of the 4th floor. Renata was 37 years old and carried on her shoulders the firmness of someone who learned early on that competence is the only currency that no one can confiscate. Her black hair was always tied in a low bun. Her posture was upright even during the hours when her feet protested inside her soft-soled white sneakers, and her dark eyes had that rare quality of looking at a patient and seeing, at the same time, the medical record, the pain, and the human being behind both things. It was this ability, more than any diploma on the wall, that made resident doctors seek her out when they were in doubt and made desperate family members calm down just by hearing the confidence with which she pronounced every explanation. On that Tuesday morning, while she was conducting the shift handover with the night team, there was a detail that any attentive observer would have noticed: the way she rested her left hand on the edge of the counter with a calculated lightness, as if she needed a discreet balance point. Her belly, already voluminous under the well-fitted teal-blue uniform, marked the 8 months of a pregnancy she had handled with the same discretion with which she handled everything in her life. She had not announced the pregnancy on any social network, she had not organized a baby shower, and she had not answered questions about the father beyond a cordial smile that neither confirmed nor denied anything. It was like that with Renata. She existed entirely inside the hospital and almost didn't exist outside of it, at least not in a way that her colleagues could track. Claudia, her shift partner for 6 years, was the only one who knew a little more. Not much, because Renata was stingy with personal details, but enough to understand that there was a story behind that woman that few would imagine. Claudia knew that Renata had a brother. She knew that this brother was rich, very rich, in a way that Renata never properly explained. She also knew that they rarely talked about him, and that on the few occasions when his name slipped into a conversation, Renata would slightly change the subject with a skill that seemed rehearsed. "Bed 7 stabilized during the night," said the night shift nurse, pointing to the medical record on the screen. "Pressure is still unstable, but Dr. Albuquerque has already been notified and will stop by during the 8 o'clock rounds." Renata made a mental note, glanced over the other beds, asked a question about bed 12, and adjusted the checking sequence she would use in the coming hours. When the night team left, she stood for a moment in the center of the nursing station, looking at the monitoring panel with that expression of someone calculating 10 things at the same time without showing any effort. "Did you sleep?" Claudia asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee, offering one. "I slept enough." Renata accepted the coffee, took a small sip. "Thank you." "Liar, but that's okay." Claudia smiled. "Alice called you yesterday afternoon, said you didn't answer." "I was at a prenatal appointment. I already called back." Claudia knew when not to push. It was one of the qualities Renata appreciated most in her, and so the shift began as it always began, with a kind of functional harmony, each team member occupying their space, monitors beeping at constant frequencies, patients being evaluated one by one with the rigor that the ICU demanded. The Instituto Paulista de Excelencia Medica was located in the Bella Vista neighborhood of São Paulo, a few blocks from Paulista Avenue. It was a high-standard private hospital, known for its impeccable structure and for serving a clientele that paid dearly for the expectation of a service that matched the price. The general ICU on the 4th floor was considered one of the best in the city, and this was largely due to the rigid protocol maintained by the nursing team, whose silent pillar was Renata. Dr. Fabio Drummond, the head of the medical sector, used to say in meetings that the distinguishing factor of that ICU was the investment in technology. What he never said, perhaps he didn't know how to articulate it, was that the real difference was the woman with the low bun who arrived at 6 in the morning, with the calm of someone who has seen everything, and the determination of someone who still believes things can improve. Around 10 in the morning, Renata was at bed 3 adjusting the intravenous infusion of a 62-year-old patient who had been admitted the previous week with acute respiratory failure. The woman was awake, her eyes open over the oxygen mask, following Renata's movements with that silent gratitude that ICU patients develop toward professionals who do not treat them as numbers. "You're going to be okay," Renata said in a low voice while checking the venous access. "Your pressure is better today than yesterday. That's progress." The patient couldn't speak through the mask, but her fingers moved slightly over the sheet, a minimal gesture that Renata understood as a response. She adjusted the sheet, checked the monitor one more time and went to the next bed with the same firm step as always, without haste and without delay, in a rhythm that seemed biologically calibrated for that environment. It was at that moment that the sound reached her, first as a distant disturbance in the hallway, then as a voice increasing in volume with the speed of something not used to meeting resistance. It was a male voice, loud, with that specific timbre of someone who speaks expecting everyone to stop and listen. Renata didn't look up immediately. She had learned over the years that reacting too quickly to noise was a sign of anxiety, and anxiety in the ICU was costly. But when Claudia appeared at the door of the nursing station with an expression she rarely used, a mixture of incredulity and restraint, Renata understood that this noise was different. "There is a man at the ICU reception," Claudia said in a low, controlled voice. "He is asking to enter without authorization. He says it's urgent. Security has already called Dr. Fabio." "What kind of complaint?" "According to him, a hand injury, but he is shouting, and he's not alone. He has 2 aides with him." Renata placed her clipboard on the counter, took a single deep breath, and walked toward the ICU reception with the same serenity with which she walked into any other difficult situation. It was always like that. The world around her could shake, and she would move forward. What she found in the hallway in front of the unit's glass door was a man of approximately 50 years old, in an impeccable charcoal grey suit, well-cut greying hair, and an improvised bandage wrapped around his right hand that, at first glance, did not seem to justify the level of urgency he emanated. There was something about him that Renata recognized immediately, not because she had seen him before, but because there was a specific type of presence she had learned to identify over the years. The presence of someone who has never heard the word no in a way that truly mattered. The man looked at her as she approached. His eyes traveled over her belly, her uniform, her bun, and then, with a rehearsed lightness that was almost insulting, he spoke. "I need to be seen now. I am not here to wait in line like anyone else." Renata looked at him for a full second before responding. It was a long second. "Good morning," she said. "I am the head nurse of this unit. Can you explain to me what happened to your hand?" He raised an eyebrow as if the question were an impertinence, and it was exactly there in that minimal gesture that Renata knew the day had changed in nature. His name was Henrique Cavalcante Neto, and in São Paulo that name opened doors that other people didn't even know existed. Henrique had built his fortune in the high-end real estate sector over 2 decades, buying land where no one else was looking, erecting towers where the right people wanted to live, and cultivating a network of relationships that mixed the highest level of politics with the highest level of private enterprise. His face had already appeared on the cover of at least 3 business magazines, always with that expression of someone who is doing the photographer a favor by smiling. He was the type of man his admirers called a visionary and his competitors called ruthless, and neither group was wrong. He had arrived at the hospital that morning not because the hand injury was serious. It was a superficial cut that occurred during an event the previous night when a crystal glass had broken inconveniently, but because Enrique Cavalcante Neto did not accept the possibility of anything in his body remaining unattended for more than a few hours. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more a matter of principle. He paid for a health plan that cost more per month than the salary of many of the professionals in that hospital, and he understood that this amount bought not just medical coverage, but absolute priority. His two aides stayed slightly behind as he faced Renata in the hallway. One of them, a young man in a dark suit who seemed to have been hired to look imposing, held a thin folder with documents. The other was fiddling with his cell phone with the urgency of someone timing their own day. "What happened to my hand is what you should be investigating, not me," Enrique said, his tone slightly impatient, as if he were correcting an obvious misunderstanding. "I need a doctor, now, not questions." "This is an ICU," Renata replied, with the same calm with which she had approached. "Intensive care unit. To be seen here, you would need a medical screening indicating a need for intensive care. A hand injury, in principle, would be treated in the emergency room, which is on the second floor." He blinked. It was a slow, calculated blink, the type of reaction of someone processing information they didn't expect to receive. "I didn't come here for the emergency room," he said. "I came here because I know Dr. Drummond personally, and he told me he could receive me." "Dr. Drummond is the head of the medical sector of this ICU," Renata said. "He can guide you regarding the flow of care, but that doesn't change this unit's protocol." There was a pause. Enrique looked at her in a different way this time, as if he were recalibrating something. There were women who backed down when he looked like that. Most, in fact. Renata did not back down. "I will need you to wait in the reception area while we check Dr. Drummond's availability," she continued, already turning slightly to indicate the direction. "One of our technicians can evaluate the injury in the meantime and check if there is a need for a referral. I am not going to wait anywhere." Enrique's voice had changed subtly. It lost the layer of forced affability, revealing something more direct underneath. "Do you know how much this hospital receives from my plan per year? Do you know how many pieces of equipment were donated by initiatives I supported?" "I am aware of how much you contribute," Renata said, and there was a surgical precision in the sentence that was not rudeness, but was also not agreement. "And that does not change this unit's protocol." The aide with the folder took a step closer. "Maybe we can resolve this another way. Can Dr. Drummond be called now?" "He has already been notified," said Claudia, who had stayed a few meters behind and was following the conversation with slightly tense shoulders. There were 3 minutes of waiting. 3 minutes in which Enrique stood in the hallway with the expression of someone making a huge sacrifice just by standing up, looking at the white walls of the unit, as if they offended him for being white and not gold. Renata went back to the nursing station, checked 2 monitors, signed a progress note, and returned to the hallway when she heard the elevator open. Dr. Fabio Drummond was 53 years old, with white hair combed with excessive care, and a way of walking that was slightly different depending on who he was talking to. With patients, he was paternalistic. With the nursing staff, he was distant. With men like Enrique Cavalcante Neto, he was effusive in a way that embarrassed those nearby. "Enrique!" He greeted him with a handshake and a smile that seemed to have been warmed up, especially for the occasion. "What a situation, my God. Let's see that hand." "Finally," Enrique said, and the word was thrown into the air in a way that was both a comment and an accusation. Renata watched the two of them enter the procedure room without saying anything. There were things she had learned to recognize over the years. One of them was when a battle could be avoided with temporary silence. But there was also a line she had never crossed to the other side, and that line involved what happened to the patients in the unit while she was present. Dr. Drummond called a nursing technician to assist with the bandage. Renata stayed in the hallway, consulting the digital medical record on her tablet, when she heard Enrique's voice raised again, this time coming from inside the room. "No, I don't want this bandage. I want the specialist doctor, orthopedics, and I want the imaging exam done now, not in 2 hours." The technician left the room with her eyes slightly wide. Renata went in. Enrique was sitting on the gurney with the posture of someone doing the furniture a favor. Dr. Drummond was examining the cut, superficial, as Renata had predicted, with an expression that tried to balance cordiality with professionalism. I can request the orthopedist on duty, Dr. Drummond was saying. Although, based on the initial assessment, there is no involvement of deep structures. I don't care about the initial assessment. What matters is what the specialist will say. Enrique turned his head and found Renata at the door. Ah, her again. Renata didn't respond to the tone. Dr. Drummond, bed 9 needed an adjustment in the sedation protocol. When you can. In a little bit, Drummond said without looking at her. Excuse me, Enrique said, and there was something new in his voice now, a deliberate weight, like someone choosing words for a specific effect. Could you wait outside? Adults are talking here. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Claudia, who had arrived at the door behind Renata, stood absolutely still. Renata looked at Enrique with an expression that was not anger. It was something colder and more precise than anger. This is my unit, she said, and while I am here, this unit's protocol will be followed by everyone, regardless of who they are. Enrique stood up from the gurney. He was taller than he appeared while sitting, and he used that height in a way that had clearly worked before in other contexts. Do you know who you are talking to? I do, Renata said. I also know that there are 12 patients in critical condition in this unit who depend on a focused team. I ask that you maintain a tone appropriate for this environment. Dr. Drummond moved slightly, uncomfortable. One of the aides appeared at the door, and Enrique Cavalcante Neto did something that no one there expected. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who had made a decision. I will remember you, he said, and there was a weight in the sentence that was not a compliment. Renata had already turned to leave when Claudia's voice reached her, cut short from behind her. She turned, and she saw. Enrique had stood up completely from the gurney and was standing less than a meter from her. What happened next was too fast for anyone present to intervene. His hand, the uninjured hand, moved in a short and precise arc, and the slap echoed through the room with a clarity that seemed to suck all other sound from the environment. The heat on Renata's left cheek was real. The silence that followed was deafening. What Renata felt in the seconds immediately following was not pain exactly. The pain would come later, when the heat subsided and the nerves finished registering what had happened. What she felt first was a kind of absolute clarity, as if the impact had swept away all the unnecessary layers of the moment and left only the essential. She was standing. The child she was carrying was fine, and there were 3 witnesses in the room. She did not back down. She did not put her hand to her face. She looked at Enrique Cavalcante Neto with the same expression she had looked at him with from the beginning, cold, precise, without the slightest tremor, and said in a low and absolutely controlled voice, "That was a mistake." Enrique seemed surprised by the reaction, or rather by the absence of a reaction. He had expected tears or screams or some form of collapse that would return control of the situation to him. What he found was a woman who looked at him as if he were an unpleasant clinical data point and not a threat. Claudia had already run out. The aide with the folder was standing at the door with the expression of someone who just realized they stepped on something that can't be easily cleaned. Dr. Drummond, and this would be the image Renata would revisit many times in the following weeks, was leaning against the side counter with his arms slightly crossed, looking at the scene with an expression that was not horror. It was calculation. Renata left the room. She walked through the ICU with the same step as always, entered the nursing station, sat in the chair at the central desk, and stayed still for exactly 30 seconds. It was an exercise she had developed over the years for situations where the body wanted to react in a way that the mind needed to evaluate first. 30 seconds. After that, she would have enough clarity to know what to do. When the 30 seconds were up, she picked up the phone and called the hospital management sector. The administrative coordinator, a woman named Patricia, whom Renata had known for years, answered on the second ring. "I need to formally record an occurrence," Renata said, with a firm voice. "Physical aggression against an employee on duty. Witnesses present. I need the immediate registration protocol." There was a short pause. "Renata, what happened?" "Register it first, then I'll explain." The afternoon that followed was a succession of events that Renata lived through with the controlled dissociation, of someone who knows they can only process everything later. The police report was filed with Claudia present as the main witness and a nursing technician who had passed by the door of the room at the exact moment of the incident. The mark on Renata's cheek was photographed by the occupational health sector. The report was filed. What Renata did not expect, or perhaps expected at some level, from having worked long enough to know the invisible gears of that institution, was the speed with which the response arrived. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Dr. Fabio Drummond entered the meeting room on the 4th floor with an expression that tried to be compassionate and was only embarrassed. Patricia was sitting next to Renata. A representative from the hospital's legal department occupied the head of the table with the posture of someone who would rather be anywhere else. "Renata," Dr. Drummond began, and the use of her first name alone said a lot. "I need you to understand that the situation is delicate for everyone." "The situation is simple," Renata said. "I was physically assaulted on duty. There is a record, there are photos, there are witnesses." "There is also," the legal representative said, with the cautious neutrality of those who have learned to sound neutral, while saying very specific things, "a statement from Mr. Cavalcante claiming there was a misunderstanding during a moment of agitation, that he deeply regrets it, and that he is willing to—" "A misunderstanding." Patricia's voice rose a pitch before she could control it. "Let him finish," Renata said, without taking her eyes off the representative. "Mr. Cavalcante is willing to reach an out-of-court settlement that includes significant financial compensation, provided that the incident is treated as closed internally." Silence lasted for a few seconds. "And the hospital is considering this," Renata said. It wasn't a question. Dr. Drummond opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Renata, Mr. Cavalcante has a long-standing relationship with this institution. There are projects underway, partnerships that—" "He assaulted me in the presence of witnesses while I was 8 months pregnant," Renata said, and for the first time there was something beyond calm in her voice, not anger but a precision that was even more cutting. "That is what happened. The rest are choices that each of you is making right now." The meeting ended at 20 to 5. At 10 past 5, Renata received a printed document brought by an administrative assistant who couldn't sustain eye contact while delivering the envelope. It was an immediate termination letter, signed by Dr. Fabio Drummond as the institutional representative, based on a paragraph that invoked inappropriate conduct with a visitor and compromising the institutional environment. Renata read the letter twice. Then she folded the paper carefully, put it inside her bag, and went to the locker room to get her personal belongings. Claudia found her in the hallway with red eyes, clearly having cried in the last 20 minutes. "Renata, this is absurd." "I will testify. I swear that—" "I know you will," Renata said, and placed her hand on her friend's arm for a second. "Take care of my patients." "And you?" "I'm going to take care of what needs to be taken care of." The elevator went down with her in silence. The ground floor lobby was busy as usual, people coming and going with that urban indifference that São Paulo practices to perfection. Renata crossed the automatic doors and stopped on the sidewalk of Rua Dona Adma Jafet, looking at the traffic in the direction of Paulista. She had worked at that hospital for 11 years. She had built a reputation that no dismissal would erase from a professional point of view, but which the market would take time to reabsorb, especially with a pending lawsuit and the bank accounts that, she would discover later that night when trying to make a payment through the app, had been preemptively blocked due to an injunction requested by Henrique Cavalcante Neto's lawyer. A move too fast to be reactive. Planned. She stood on the sidewalk for perhaps a full minute. The late afternoon sun in São Paulo had that orange quality that made shadows long, and her belly felt heavy in a different way than usual. It wasn't the physical weight, which she had learned to carry, but something she could only describe as the weight of realizing she had lost, in a single day, most of what she had built alone. Inside the apartment, hours later, sitting in the armchair in the bedroom with her feet on the floor and her cell phone in hand, she sat looking at a contact she had saved with a simple name, M. There was a rule between them. She had created this rule, and he had respected it, for years, without complaint, even when she knew he would have preferred not to respect it. The rule was simple, her life was hers. She had chosen to build something with her own hands, regardless of who he was or what he could offer. She didn't want the umbrella. She wanted to learn to cross the rain. But there was also a second part of the rule, a silent agreement made on a night many years ago, in a different apartment, in a different city. If she ever needed, truly needed, she would call, and he would answer. Renata looked at her belly. She thought about the daughter who was about to come into the world. She thought about the blocked accounts, the lawsuit, the lost job, and everything she had built collapsing like a structure someone had removed the screws from without her noticing. Then she dialed. The phone rang once. Just once. Renata. The voice on the other side was calm, deep, and there was something in it she couldn't quite name, a mixture of relief and something that seemed like contained pain, like someone who had waited for this call for a long time and had never wished it would be necessary. I already know. I already know. The three words hung in the air of the room for a moment. Renata felt something move inside her, not the baby, not this time, but something older and deeper, a sensation she had learned to associate with her brother's presence, even when he was not physically near. How do you know? She asked, and her voice came out lower than she expected. It doesn't matter how. A short pause. Are you okay? Is the baby okay? We are fine. She adjusted her position in the armchair, placing her feet on the low ottoman she had bought specifically for the last months of pregnancy. Marcelo, my accounts are blocked. I have a lawsuit. I don't have a job. I know. You knew before I called. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, and there was a huge difference between the two things, a difference the two of them had spent years negotiating in silence. Yes, he said, and you waited for me to call. It was the only right thing to do. Another pause. You built a life that was yours. I wasn't going to enter it without being called. Renata closed her eyes for a second. There were things she could say, about the years she had kept a deliberate distance, about the choices she had made to be Renata Souza the nurse, and not the sister of Marcelo Souza, whatever that meant to the world around him. But it wasn't the time for that. I need you to help me unblock the accounts, she said, and I need a lawyer. Dr. Vivian Lopez will call you tomorrow at 9 in the morning. She is the best there is for this type of situation. The accounts will be operational by tomorrow at noon. The speed with which he responded said everything. He had already thought about it. He had probably thought about it even before she called. Marcelo? Yes. What are you going to do? The question hung in the air for a few seconds. When the answer came, it was careful, not evasive but careful, like someone who chooses every word with the awareness that they matter. I'm going to do what needs to be done, the right way, without you needing to get involved. I want to know. You will know, when it's resolved. She could have pushed. At other times, she would have. But there was something in his tone, the same quality she had always noticed in her brother's voice, a kind of calm weight that suggested things were already in motion, that the gears were already turning. That made her realize that pushing wouldn't change anything. Marcelo had been like that since she could remember. When he said something would be done, it was done. When he said it would be the right way, it was the right way. I don't want violence, she said. It was never like that, he replied, and there was a firmness in his voice that needed no explanation. They spoke for a few more minutes, about the baby, about the apartment, about whether she needed anything immediate. When she hung up, Renata sat with the phone in her lap for a long time, looking at the dark window where the city lights created that familiar São Paulo pattern at night, an infinity of luminous points that from afar seemed orderly and up close were pure, functional chaos. She didn't know everything about Marcelo's life. There were things he had never explained, and that she had learned not to ask. Not out of fear, but out of a kind of tacit agreement that respected each other's boundaries. What she knew was that her brother had built, over many years, an influence that was not measured in positions or titles. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a businessman in the conventional sense. It was something harder to name, someone who knew the invisible connections between things and knew how to touch them in the right place. She went to sleep later than she should have, and woke up at 6 in the morning with the habit of someone who spent 11 years being pulled back to reality by the shift alarm. For a moment, in the zone between sleep and wakefulness, she felt the automatic impulse to get up, tie her hair and go to work. Then the memory returned, and she stayed in bed for a few more minutes, letting the weight of reality redistribute itself through her body before sitting up. At 8:42, even before the call from Dr. Vivian Lopez, a message arrived from Claudia. "Renata, you need to know something. There are 3 more people here who are willing to give a formal statement, including Nair from the night shift, who was passing through the hallway. No one here agrees with what was done to you." Renata read the message twice. She replied, "Thank you. I'm going to need you." At 9 o'clock sharp, the phone rang with a São Paulo number she didn't recognize. "Dr. Vivian Lopes," said the voice on the other side, objective, clear, with that rhythm of someone used to turning complex situations into lists of actions. "I have been hired to represent you. I already have access to all relevant documents. We need to talk about strategy before the deadline to contest the injunction expires tomorrow." "Go ahead," Renata said. The injunction to block accounts was requested based on an allegation of reverse moral damage. That is, Mr. Cavalcante's lawyer argued preemptively, that you could seek resources that would damage his reputation. It is an aggressive and technically questionable move. With the witnesses you have, it falls apart. And the dismissal? Termination for cause without proven cause. For an employee with an indefinite contract, pregnant, with an impeccable functional record, and 11 years with the company. It's a textbook case of discriminatory dismissal. The hospital will want to avoid judicial exposure before it reaches a public hearing. Renata processed this. "How long?" "For the account blocking, by tomorrow at noon, as agreed. For the termination, weeks for a settlement, months for a judgment if they want to fight. But they won't want to fight, trust me. And the lawsuit he filed against me? There is no lawsuit. There is a threat of a lawsuit that was never effectively filed. Your previous lawyer, who by the way was hired by the hospital and not by you, which is already a conflict of interest, probably didn't inform you of this distinction." Renata had not had a previous lawyer. She had only received a call from a man who identified himself as a legal representative of the hospital and said she would be notified soon. She had understood at that moment the extent of what she was facing. "So, what do we do now?" she asked. "First, you authorize me to file the contestation of the injunction today. Second, I contact the hospital to open negotiations about the termination. Third, and this is important, you don't make any public statements. Don't respond to journalists if any seek you out, and don't post anything on social media. Strategic silence is a tool." "Understood. One last thing." Dr. Vivian's voice became a tone lower, not out of confidence, but precision. "Regardless of what happens in the coming days with Mr. Cavalcante, you need to be focused on your legal situation and your health. There are matters happening in parallel that are not your responsibility to manage. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Renata understood. There were things in motion that were not managed by female lawyers, and while Dr. Vivian Lopez built a legal fortress around Renata, somewhere she couldn't see and wouldn't try to see, the brother who had respected her distance for years was finally acting. She placed her hand on her belly and felt her daughter move, a slow, deliberate movement, like a silent affirmation. And for the first time since the previous afternoon, Renata Souza took a deep breath and let the air out slowly, without haste, without excessive control. There was a storm coming, but this time she wasn't on the wrong side of it. Henrique Cavalcante Neto woke up on Thursday with the specific satisfaction of someone who believes they have ended a problem. He had slept well, had an even better dinner, and spent the previous night in the Jardim Europa apartment with the tranquility of someone who has already calculated all angles of a situation and found them favorable. The lawyer had guaranteed that the injunction was solid. The hospital had arranged the dismissal. The nurse, as much as she had that annoying quality of not showing fear, was now without a job, without immediate income, and with a pending lawsuit, or at least with the perception of a pending lawsuit, which produced the same practical effect. It was the way things worked. Henrique had learned this long before he had enough money to apply the learning. The world organized itself around those who had the most to lose, and those who could make the other lose faster. It was a simple equation, and he had spent 20 years being very good at calculating it. The breakfast meeting with his institutional relations team went normally. There were 3 projects underway: a residential complex in Chakara Klabin, a land renegotiation in the Marumbi region, and a partnership agreement with a foreign investment fund that was reaching the final stage of due diligence. They were big moves, each representing hundreds of millions of reais in potential. Henrique moved between subjects with the fluency of someone who had built this universe with his own hands. It was on Friday morning that the first sign appeared. His financial director, Rodrigo, called at 8:40 with a voice that tried to sound casual and failed. "Henrique, I need you to look at the numbers for the Cavalcante 3 fund's operational account." "What about it?" "There was a movement yesterday afternoon that I don't recognize. An exit. Small technically, but the bank classified it as a routine transfer when it wasn't." Henrique frowned. "How much?" 240,000. "The problem isn't the amount. The problem is that I didn't authorize it, you didn't authorize it. And when I went to trace the origin of the instruction, the bank system says it came from an authorized internal access." "That's impossible." "I know. I'm talking to the account manager now, but I thought you should know immediately." Henrique hung up and stood looking at the office window on the 22nd floor on Faria Lima, with the skyscrapers of São Paulo stretching in all directions as a visual argument for scale and power. 240,000 was irrelevant in the dimension of what he moved, but system errors didn't happen, and unauthorized internal accesses didn't either. He called the corporate IT aide and spent the next morning reviewing access logs. They found nothing conclusive. The transfer had been reversed by the bank at 3 in the afternoon. Operational error was the explanation, with a formal apology that sounded too rehearsed to be spontaneous. Henrique filed the episode in a mental folder of things to monitor and went about his day. On Saturday, the Foreign Investment Fund sent an email asking for an extension of the deadline for due diligence. The justification was technical, related to regulatory documentation in the country of origin. Henrique replied confirming the extension without questioning it. These things happened. But there was something in the choice of words in the email that left him slightly uncomfortable. A coldness that hadn't been there the week before. On Monday, 3 things happened almost simultaneously. First, 2 of the 4 directors of the Klabin Complex board sent messages asking for an urgent meeting. The subject indicated was review of contractual clauses, which in practice meant someone had shown them something that concerned them. Second, the bank where Henrique kept his main personal reserves, not the corporate bank, but the private wealth management institution where he had concentrated a significant portion of his personal assets, called asking for an in-person meeting for portfolio alignment. In 8 years of relationship with that bank, no manager had ever asked for an in-person meeting without prior notice. Third, Leonardo Freire, one of the partners of the law firm that had handled his interests for over 10 years, called to say he was impeded from continuing to provide services due to a potential conflict of interest identified internally. No further explanations, no indication of who the conflict was with. With a request that Henrique arrange alternative representation for ongoing matters, Henrique stood looking at the phone after this last call with an expression his employees hadn't seen before. Not anger, not calculation, but something close to genuine perplexity. He called Rodrigo. "Do you think these things have a connection?" "Honestly?" A pause. "I don't know. It could be a coincidence. It could be that the market is reacting to some news I haven't seen. But Leonardo Freire's departure makes no sense by any conventional logic. He's been part of our firm for a decade. Conflict of interest with whom? He didn't say. Henrique went to the meeting with the bank on Tuesday morning and listened with growing attention as the relationship manager, a middle-aged man who had always been cordial to the point of servility, explained with much circumspection that there were internal compliance concerns related to movements that needed additional documentation. The movements were legitimate. Henrique knew it, the bank knew it, but someone had formally requested a review. and reviews took time, and during that time, certain products in the portfolio would be temporarily unavailable. He left the meeting with the new and unpleasant feeling that the ground had become slightly less solid than it seemed. That afternoon, his personal assistant entered the room with a tense expression. "Henrique, there is a person waiting at reception. They don't have an appointment. They say they have a message for you." "Who is it?" "They didn't give a name. They just left a card." The assistant placed a simple business card on the table, thick paper, cream color, no logo, no phone number, no address. Just a symbol printed in the center, a circle with a horizontal line crossing it, simple and geometric, which did not correspond to any company or visual identity Henrique recognized. "What did they say?" "They just said Mr. Cavalcante would know what it means." Henrique stood looking at the card for a long moment. He didn't know what it meant, and that was exactly the most disturbing piece of information from everything that had happened in the last few days. For the first time in many years, there was something in the game that he hadn't placed there, and he couldn't identify its origin. He sent for the person, but when the assistant returned 2 minutes later, he said they had left. That night, Henrique Cavalcante Neto stayed awake later than usual, mentally reviewing every detail of the last few weeks, trying to find a logic, a sequence, a point of origin that explained why the world around him had begun to behave slightly differently without anyone telling him why. And it was in this silent review, sitting on the apartment balcony with the city spread out below, that a name returned to his memory. Not with urgency, but with the discreet persistence of a spark that doesn't go out. The nurse. He pushed the thought away almost immediately. It was impossible. What could a fired, pregnant nurse without resources have to do with movements in private funds and the departure of top-tier law firms? It was paranoia. It was the accumulated stress of an atypical week distorting his analysis. But the card was still on the office desk, and the symbol on it, that simple circle with a line, remained there, without an answer, like a question asked in a voice too low for him to pretend he hadn't heard. The second week began with a speed Henrique hadn't experienced in any of his years in the business world. It wasn't the speed of a conventional crisis. He had navigated a few of those and knew what they were like. Loud, visible, full of journalists at the door and lawyers in a panic. This was different. It was silent. It was like watching the tide go out at a slightly accelerated speed, with all the appearance of normalcy, while the ground under his feet became less firm with each hour. On Monday, the two directors of the Klabin complex confirmed the meeting. Henrique went prepared with presentations, with data, with the confidence of someone who knows the numbers are on his side. What he found were two men who listened to him attentively and then said with a cordiality that was clearly a technical resource that they needed more time to evaluate the strategic alignment of the project with new corporate governance parameters that had been recommended to them by an externally hired consultancy. External consultancy, recently hired. Henrique asked for the name of the consultancy. They provided it, a company he didn't recognize, with an elegant institutional website and very little traceable history. The type of company that exists to exist in documents and not to be found. On Tuesday, the foreign fund formally withdrew its partnership proposal. The email was brief, formal, without substantive explanations, and was signed by a lawyer he had never seen in previous negotiations. Rodrigo spent 2 hours trying to contact the usual interlocutors and received no return from any of them. "It's as if they changed the whole team from one day to the next," Rodrigo said in the afternoon call. There was tension in his voice, not panic, but the kind of tension that appears when an experienced professional recognizes a pattern they can't classify. "Henrique, do you have some new enemy I don't know about?" "Everyone in this market has enemies. I'm asking about a specific enemy, someone who has so much access to these spheres that they can, I don't know how to describe it exactly, who can make people disappear without making noise." Henrique didn't respond immediately. He was looking at the symbol on the cream card he had kept on the table, unable to throw it away for a reason he couldn't rationally articulate. "I'm going to make some calls," he said. The calls on Wednesdays and Thursdays were revealing in a way he didn't expect. Not because people said anything explicitly, it was the opposite. People who usually answered immediately took longer. Those who used to be enthusiastic were restrained. Those who never cancelled meetings sent requests to reschedule. And in 2 conversations, one with a long-time business partner, another with an investor who had participated in 3 projects in the last 6 years, Enrique had the clear feeling that there was something the other person knew and wasn't saying. A deliberate caution, like someone instructed not to commit. He sent a private investigator to gather information on the consultancy that had been mentioned by the Klabin directors. The return arrived in 24 hours. The company had been incorporated about 4 months ago, had its registered headquarters at a shared commercial address in Itaim Bibi, and its nominal partners were 3 individuals with no relevant business history. What lay behind those partners, the investigator couldn't trace. The shareholding instruments led to other structures that led to other structures, in a chain of layers that seemed to have been designed specifically not to end anywhere recognizable. On Friday, Dr. Fabio Drummond called Enrique. It was the first time the doctor had initiated contact since the episode at the hospital, and his voice had changed significantly since the last time. The effusiveness, the audible smile, had vanished, and what remained was something that sounded very much like fear disguised as professionalism. "Enrique, we need to talk about the hospital." "What about the hospital?" "There was an acquisition proposal, a formal offer to buy controlling interest in the Instituto Paulista. At the price they're offering, the board is going to accept." Enrique stood still. "Who is buying?" "It's a holding company. I can't identify who is behind it. My contact on the board said the process was started about 2 weeks ago and advanced with a speed he had never seen in an acquisition process." 2 weeks. Enrique did the calculation without having to think much. 2 weeks ago was the day after the episode in the ICU. "Fabio," he said, and his voice came out with a different texture than in recent weeks, lower, more direct, with the weight of something he hadn't yet admitted to himself. "This symbol. A circle with a horizontal line. Have you seen this?" A pause. "Where did you see it?" "On a card. Someone left it at my reception." Another pause, longer. "Enrique, I need to tell you something." The doctor's voice dropped even lower. "After what happened with Renata, after the dismissal, 2 members of the medical team approached me saying they had received contacts from a law firm they didn't recognize, wanting to collect formal statements about the episode. I didn't pay attention at the time. Now I'm wondering if I should have." "That's her sister. She hired a lawyer." "Enrique." Drummond's voice got even lower, and there was something in it now approaching an uncomfortable revelation. "Did you research who Renata Souza is? Not as a nurse, as a person. Who is her family?" There was a strange quality to the question, as if Drummond knew something he had taken too long to share. "Why are you asking me this now?" "Because I researched it. Yesterday, after the contact from that firm." A meaningful pause. The surname Souza is too common to track alone, but when you associate it with her hometown, Curitiba, she mentioned it once at a conference, and the brother she has whom she never introduced to anyone here, and the fact that in Curitiba there is a family with that surname associated with a level of influence that doesn't appear in any publication because it was built deliberately out of the spotlight. "Fabio," Enrique's voice came out sharp, "speak straight." "Her brother." Another pause. "I think it's Marcelo Souza." The name hung in the air. Enrique didn't respond immediately because he was processing, and processing took longer than usual for him because the name Marcelo Souza belonged to a category of information he had always received in a fragmented, indirect way, as if the people who mentioned it didn't want to give it too much weight. It was the kind of name that appeared in whispered conversations among people who knew how things really worked. Not in newspapers, not in lawsuits, not on any visible surface of public life, but in certain circles, at certain moments, when someone wanted to explain why something had happened in a way that didn't make sense by any conventional path, the name appeared. Always as context, never as the protagonist. And now it was associated with the woman he had assaulted in an ICU on a Tuesday morning. "Are you sure?" Enrique asked. "I'm not sure of anything," Drummond said, But the circle with the line on the card you received, someone here on the team recognized it. It's the symbol that represents a promise kept in certain contexts that name frequence. Henrique hung up the phone slowly, with a precision that was the opposite of the agitation taking over the rest of his body. He stood looking at the card on the desk. Then he looked at the phone, then at the window. And for the first time in many years, Henrique Cavalcante Neto felt the ground under his feet truly disappear. The meeting was requested by Henrique. It was important that this be recorded, that it had been he who asked for the meeting, not the other way around. At some level he couldn't admit out loud. This detail mattered. It was the last thing that still felt like a choice. The address was sent by message from a number that appeared on Henrique's phone on a Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the episode in the ICU. It was an office in Itaim Bibi, in a discreet corporate building, with no sign at the entrance other than the floor number. Henrique went with an aide and a substitute lawyer he had hired in a hurry after Leonardo Frade's departure. When they reached the 13th floor and the elevator doors opened, the aide and the lawyer were politely informed by an employee to wait in the waiting room. Only Henrique went forward. The room he was led to was large, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed São Paulo in a panorama that in other contexts would be impressive. It was furnished with a restraint that seemed purposeful, nothing excessive, nothing unnecessary, every element in the right place with the quality of someone who doesn't need to demonstrate anything. Henrique recognized this instinctively, because he had learned throughout his career that people who needed to show power showed it on the walls and in the furniture, and those who truly held it preferred the silence of neutral surfaces. Marcelo Souza was standing near the window when Henrique entered. He was 52 years old, with short graying hair and a posture that was neither rigid nor inviting. He wore a simple navy blue suit, no tie. When he turned to look at Henrique, there was that same quality in his eyes that Henrique had noticed in his sister, the ability to look at someone and see more than the surface without showing effort. The two men looked at each other for a moment. "Mr. Cavalcante," Marcelo said. His voice was deep, calm, and there was no affectation of hostility in it, which was, strangely, more disconcerting than if there had been. "Souza." Henrique crossed the room and sat in the chair on the opposite side of the desk without being invited. It was an automatic gesture of demarcation. He always sat first, always occupied the space first. Marcelo noticed the gesture and didn't comment. He sat on the other side with the same calm as before. "You requested this meeting," Marcelo said. "You know why. I want to hear you say it." Henrique looked at him. "The last 3 weeks happened because of your sister." "The last 3 weeks," Marcelo said, "happened because of what you did." There was a fundamental difference in the formulation of the two sentences, and both men understood that without needing to discuss it. Henrique drummed a finger on the table and then stopped, aware that the gesture revealed agitation he didn't want to show. "What do you want?" Henrique asked. "It's not about what I want." Marcelo opened a folder on the table, not dramatically, but with the precise gesture of someone who had prepared it with care. "It's about what needs to be done." Henrique looked at the documents. They were pages of reports, statements, contracts. Not his, or at least not entirely. There were documents he recognized with a growing sensation in his stomach, because they were documents that shouldn't exist outside of certain digital vaults with extremely restricted access. These are irregularities in 3 public concession contracts from the last 8 years, Marcelo said, with the neutrality of someone describing a natural phenomenon. Documented overpricing in 2 tenders, and a set of correspondences that quite clearly established the relationship between certain regulatory decisions and certain financial flows that passed through structures linked to your name. Henrique didn't respond immediately. He was calculating. It was what he did in high-pressure situations. He calculated, looked for angles, sought the exit he hadn't yet seen. "This can be contested in any court," he said. "It can," Marcelo agreed, "and it would be a long, expensive, and very public process." A pause. "Or it can go nowhere." The silence that followed had a specific texture, the silence of a negotiation that hadn't officially begun, but had already established all its real terms. "What do you want?" Henrique said again, and this time it wasn't a question but an opening. Marcelo placed another sheet on the table. It was a fund incorporation document, a legal instrument for asset transfer to a charitable entity. The name of the fund was in the header, Maternal Vulnerability Support Fund. Henrique read the figures. They were very specific and they were large. "This is my fortune," he said. "It is part of it, the part that was built with the instruments in that folder." Marcelo pointed to the documents with a gentle gesture. "The rest is yours. The part you built cleanly, and there is a clean part. I checked that carefully before acting." Henrique stood looking at the document. There was something almost ironic in the destination of the resources, a fund for vulnerable mothers, specifically. He didn't believe in coincidences enough to think the choice had been casual. "And if I don't sign?" Then the documents in this folder reach the right places, and the process begins. Marcelo spoke without emotion, as if describing a weather forecast. "You have the resources to go through a long process, but you don't have the resources to go through a long process and still maintain the trust network that took decades to build. You know that." It was true. Henrique knew it. He had seen what happened to people in his circle when trust vanished, not in a dramatic collapse, but in that discreet and irreversible crumbling of relationships that didn't go back. "There is a second part," Marcelo said. Henrique raised his eyes. "You will withdraw all legal actions against my sister. All measures taken regarding her are undone, and Dr. Fabio Drummond signs a resignation letter from the position of medical chief within 48 hours. A pause. "This last point he already knows. He contacted me yesterday asking for guidance on how to proceed." Henrique closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, there was a different expression on his face, not of defeat exactly, but of someone who had reached the end of a calculation and found a result he didn't expect. "You watched," Henrique said suddenly. It was an intuition and it was precise. "You were there. At the hospital." Marcelo didn't respond immediately. When he spoke, it was with that same calm that didn't break. "I respect my sister's choices. She chose an independent life and I respected that for years." A pause. "But I never completely stopped taking care of her. There is a difference between controlling and protecting." "You were there," Henrique repeated, processing. "I was in a place where I could see her without her knowing, a promise I made to myself." Marcelo's voice got slightly lower, not with dramatic emotion, but with the weight of something genuine. "When that happened, I needed all my control not to act right then and there. But she didn't want me to act. She wanted to resolve it with her own resources first. And when she called you, it was when her own resources were blocked by you." Marcelo opened his hands on the table in an almost philosophical gesture. "You didn't just assault a pregnant woman. You tried to destroy the life she took years building with her own hands, independently of me. That was what I couldn't let pass." Henrique stood looking at the document, at the figures, at the name of the fund, at the irony chosen with surgical precision. Then he picked up the pen that was on the table, placed there in advance, he realized, and signed. Marcelo collected the documents without haste. If he felt any satisfaction, he didn't show it, and that, Henrique thought, was perhaps the clearest sign that he had been facing someone of a different species from his own. "One last thing," Marcelo said, already standing up. "My sister doesn't know the details of this conversation, and she won't know." "Why?" "Because she doesn't need to. She won't because of her own merit, because of the dignity she maintained when you tried to destroy her. The rest is just consequence." Henrique sat in the room for a few more minutes after Marcelo left, looking at the skyscrapers of São Paulo through the window, trying to find something in the familiar panorama that still looked the way it had been before. He found nothing different out there. The city was the same. It was he who had changed position within it, in a way that didn't go back. The news that the Instituto Paulista de Excelencia Médica had been acquired by a holding company reached the fourth-floor team in a meeting called by the new administrative management in the last week of October. The announcement was read by a woman in a burgundy suit whom Claudia had never seen, with a precision that wasn't cold. It was just objective, like someone who respects people's time enough not to ornament it with unnecessary flourishes. The holding company was called Instituto Sousa de Gestão em Saúde. It had been incorporated less than 6 months ago and had moved the acquisition process with a speed that the oldest members of the board described, in hallway conversations, as something they had never seen in 30 years in the market. The price paid was fair, generous even, and the new management had confirmed that all current employment contracts would be maintained, with a review of positions and salaries scheduled for the following first quarter. The only immediate change, communicated in the same meeting, was the departure of Dr. Fabio Drummond from the position of head of the medical sector. The official note said, leadership restructuring aligned with new institutional parameters. What the note didn't say, and what circulated in the hallways with the silent speed that important information has in hospital environments, was that Drummond had been relocated to a second-tier administrative function in a sector with no prestige and no decision-making power, with a salary that represented less than half of his previous one. The man who had ignored testimonies, signed an indefensible dismissal, and calculated that Henrique Cavalcante Neto's power was more durable than a nurse's integrity, now occupied a windowless room in the basement of the same hospital where he had exercised his influence for 14 years. Claudia knew all this before calling Renata. She held the phone for a few minutes, trying to find the right words, and then realized there were no right words for it. There was only the truth, and the truth was enough. Renata answered on the third ring. Her voice was different from when they had spoken in recent weeks, more rested, with a rounder quality, like someone who had gone back to sleeping completely after a period of constant alert. Claudia. It was almost a question by the intonation. The hospital has changed owners, Claudia said, and you need to know something else too. She breathed. They withdrew all actions against you. Dr. Viviane called me thinking you might not have checked your email yet. The lawsuit no longer exists. The accounts have been released for 3 weeks. You already knew that. But now there's also a formal settlement proposal regarding the termination, an amount that Dr. Viviane said you won't want to refuse. On the other side, silence. A silence Claudia knew. It was the silence of Renata processing, that interval before any response that meant she was organizing information with the same precision she organized everything. And Drummond? Renata asked. Claudia told her. She heard another pause. All right, Renata said finally. And there was something in the sentence that wasn't coldness or satisfaction, but a kind of serene closing, the quality of someone seeing an account settled without having needed to scream for it to happen. What Renata didn't know, and Claudia also didn't completely know, was the extent of what had happened to Henrique Cavalcante Neto in the previous weeks. What reached public knowledge in a fragmented way, and without the details that would have required deep journalistic investigation, was that the public prosecutor's office had received a series of documents related to irregularities in public concession contracts linked to the Cavalcante Group. The process had been initiated regularly, through legitimate channels, with evidence solid enough that the formal opening was just a matter of time. Henrique had hired 3 new lawyers in rapid succession. He had tried to mobilize contacts in spheres that, weeks before, he would have activated without difficulty. And he had discovered systematically that these contacts were no longer available the way they used to be. The fortune still existed in part, the clean part as had been specified with surgical precision, but the Maternal Vulnerability Support Fund had received an irrevocable transfer that represented the portion built on land that couldn't withstand the weight of inspection, and Henrique Cavalcante Neto's name, which had appeared on covers of business magazines, now appeared in news pages with a different tone, not of spectacular scandal, but of gradual and irreversible decline, which was, in the perspective of those who understood how these things worked, much more definitive. Renata knew parts of this through Claudia, other parts through Dr. Viviane, and some, the most specific ones, explaining how certain gears had clicked together. She never fully knew, and she didn't ask. She had made a choice, years before, not to know more than she needed to know about her brother's life, and that choice had sustained itself even in the face of the temptation to understand. There was something clean in this deliberate ignorance, something that preserved what she had built, What she did know, because she needed to know to move forward, was that the Instituto Sousa de Gestão M. Saúde was, in fact, linked to her brother. Marcelo hadn't tried to hide it from her. He had called one October afternoon with the same calm voice as always and said, "The hospital is mine now. You don't have to go back there if you don't want to, but if you do, the position is open, with the conditions you deserve to have from the beginning. You bought the hospital because of me," she said. "I bought the hospital because it was an undervalued asset with significant management potential," he said. A pause. "And because the only way to guarantee that what happened to you never happened to any other person in that place was to change who made the decisions." It was the most Marcelo answer possible, and Renata had smiled, a smile he didn't see because they were on the phone, but which she suspected he had somehow perceived anyway. "I'm going to need about 3 months," she said, "when you're ready." And so it had been. 3 months. The time she would need to have her daughter recover, reorganize her life, and decide, with a cool head and a heart in order, what she wanted for the next chapter. In those weeks that followed, Renata had done things she hadn't done in a long time. She had slept later than the alarm told her to. She had cooked calmly. She had read books that weren't clinical protocol manuals. She had hosted Claudia at home for dinner on a Wednesday night and spent 3 hours talking about things that weren't work. She had gradually allowed life to enter through the spaces that excessive routine had kept closed for years. And there was one afternoon, a specific afternoon with a clear sky of that October São Paulo blue that appears sometimes as a promise, where she had sat on the apartment balcony with a cup of tea that had cooled without her noticing, looking at the city and thinking there was something she needed to acknowledge to herself. She had won. Not because her brother had intervened, although the intervention had been necessary and she wasn't hypocritical enough not to recognize that. She had won because she had stayed standing when it would have been easier to fall, because she had filed the report when it would have been simpler to accept the silence, because she had maintained her dignity in a moment when the brutality of another had tried to convince her that dignity was a luxury disadvantaged people couldn't afford. The daughter had been born in the first week of November in a different hospital from the Instituto Paulista, a deliberate choice by Renata, because there are things that need a new space to start right. The birth had been smooth, or as smooth as births usually are, and when they placed her in her arms for the first time, Renata had looked at that face and felt something she couldn't immediately name, a mixture of recognition and wonder, like someone who finds something they had waited for long enough to no longer be sure it would come. The name she had chosen was Clara. Simple, clean, without excessive weight of tribute or expectation. Clara Sousa. A name that could be anything. The 4th floor of the Instituto Paulista de Excelencia Médica had changed in a way that was hard to describe precisely, but easy to perceive. It wasn't the walls. They remained white, with that clinical cleanliness that admits no ornament. It wasn't the equipment. The monitors were the same. The medication carts made the same metallic sound as they slid down the hallway. It was something else. It was the quality of the air, perhaps, or the way people moved within it, with less of the compressed tension Claudia had learned to recognize as the permanent state of that place during years of management that prioritized appearance over substance. The new administrative direction had implemented changes that seemed small in isolation and were huge as a whole. An occurrence registration protocol with a direct and anonymous channel to central management, a zero-tolerance policy for any form of pressure on clinical decisions, and a complete review of the position structure that had elevated 3 senior nurses to coordination positions with corresponding compensation. Claudia was one of them. When Renata returned, it was on a February morning. The sun entered through the hallway windows with that specific quality of late São Paulo summer, strong, direct, unapologetic, and she arrived at 6 in the morning with her low bun in place, her white soft-soled sneakers, and a 3-month-old daughter at home in the care of a trusted person Marcelo had arranged with the same silent efficiency he had arranged everything else. Claudia was waiting for her with 2 cups of coffee. "Welcome back," she said, offering one. "Thank you." Renata accepted, took a small sip. She looked around with that expression of someone recalibrating, checking if the environment matched the memory and deciding what to do with the differences. "It's different," Renata said. "It's better," Claudia replied. And it was. It was better in a way that didn't erase what had happened. Nothing erased it, and Renata had no interest in pretending it did, but that made the place habitable again. Again, capable of being what it had always been in its best version. A space where people in fragility could find competent and human care, without the weight of invisible hierarchies distorting every decision. Renata spent the morning doing what she had always done. Evaluating the beds with attention, talking to patients who were awake, organizing protocols with the team that had returned to work with her, as if the interval had been just a recess and not a rupture. There was a new technician she didn't know, a resident who treated her with a deference that seemed exaggerated until she realized he had heard the story and had processed it as if it were a case study on the type of professional worth becoming. At 10 in the morning, the phone vibrated in her pocket with a message from Marcelo. "How is it going?" She replied with 3 words. "As it always was." He replied with a single character, a period, which she interpreted as his version of a smile. It was like that with them. There was a distance they preserved not out of coldness, but out of respect for the ways each had chosen to exist in the world. Marcelo hadn't entered her life to stay. He had entered to adjust what needed to be adjusted and receded back to the space he had always occupied. Present in a way she felt more than saw, available in a way she hoped never to have to activate again in the same way. What had changed, after all, was something subtle. She had accepted that the independence she had built wasn't diminished by having asked for help once. That building, something with one's own hands, didn't mean refusing the extended hand of someone who loved you in moments when your own hands weren't enough. There was a younger version of Renata who had confused autonomy with isolation, and that confusion had cost her years of unnecessary loneliness. The version of her that had returned to that 4th floor in February understood the difference. As for Henrique Cavalcante Neto, the public prosecutor's process had advanced with the solidity that proper documentation produces when it reaches the right hands. He had hired the best defense available with the resources he still had, and that defense was good enough to make the process long. But long wasn't the same as uncertain, and the people who used to orbit around the Cavalcante name had learned to calculate probabilities with the coldness the market demands. The orbit had dissolved, not in a dramatic way, not with public statements or spectacular betrayals, just with the natural gravity of things that lose the mass that made them central. The Maternal Vulnerability Support Fund had begun its operations in the month of January, with a lean administrative structure and selection criteria that prioritized women at greatest risk. In March, it had served 73 beneficiaries. In April, 118. The irony chosen with surgical precision had transformed in practice into something real, into concrete support for people who needed it, funded by resources that had been extracted from where they never should have been. Renata knew this through Dr. Viviane, who had accompanied the constitution of the fund as part of the legal agreements, and when she knew, she stood for a moment in silence, processing the specific outline of that irony, that the man who had tried to destroy a vulnerable mother had been the involuntary instrument of creating a permanent support structure for so many others. It was a justice of an uncommon quality, not spectacular, not satisfying in the way the initial anger asked for. It was deeper than that. It was the type of resolution that made no noise, but that stayed. In the afternoon of that first day back, while writing the progress notes for the patients, Renata stopped for a moment and looked at her own hands on the keyboard, the same hands that had adjusted infusions and checked monitors for 11 years, the same hands that had held Clara 3 months earlier with the care of someone receiving something precious and unrepeatable. She had maintained her dignity. She had maintained the records. She had called her brother when she needed to. She had let the lawyer do the work the lawyer knew how to do. She had rested when her body asked. She had returned when she was ready, and she had brought back to that place with her white sneakers and low bun and the 2 cups of coffee with Claudia, the same quality of presence that had been the real difference of that 4th floor during all those years. Not the equipment, not the architectural standard, but the ability to look at a person in fragility and see at the same time the medical record, the pain, and the human being behind both things. That was it. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything. If you made it this far with Renata, you already know that the truest stories don't end with explosions. They end with someone returning to where they always belonged, more whole than they left. If this story touched something in you, leave a like. It's simple to do and means a lot to those who tell these stories with care. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of other lives that deserve to be told. And in the comments, tell us, do you know someone like Renata? Someone who stayed standing when the world pushed them down? This space is yours. We read everything. End of story.